Okay, in this episode of our live stream, we're going to go through some very basic MOTOTRBO programming examples. So we're probably going to start out with a basic back-to-back single channel. Doesn't matter about the frequency. What matters is the DMR group, the DMR color code, and making sure that we have the group in the RX group correctly. So let's make a start. So this video assumes that you've already installed MOTOTRBO. We're using version 16 here, but if your radio doesn't need version 16, you might be using version 14 or whatever. It makes no difference. This example works no matter what. So let's go to the Motorola MOTOTRBO default folder, which is here, MOTOTRBO. So if you just follow my steps, and there are some in this folder. There's what's called samples. So let's make a start with find a DP radio. Let's assume that you've got a DP 1400, which is that radio there. Click open. Okay, that takes a second. Bear in mind this is a live video, so I can't pause and jump around. You've just got to bear with me. This particular code plug assumes that we've got a VHF radio of 136 megs to 174 megs, which is a standard VHF radio frequency range. Okay, so if you, at this stage, you can either open this code plug if you just want to do some theoretical programming, but if you actually want to use this guide to program your radio, you're probably going to have to click the read button, which is here, assuming that your radio is plugged in with a cable and switched on. So click read and you'll end up in pretty much the same place as me. Now, this is assuming that you've got a digital and analog DP 1400 or a digital and analog enabled MOTOTRBO radio. It doesn't matter which one really for the purposes of this. But we'll start pretty much here where the channels are. So you'll notice that if we collapse all this lot, yep. So you'll notice that you've got a tree of information and settings, and every time you click the plus button to the left of each tree, it expands. But we'll start at the top. So let's start with general settings and explain what the things that we need for this particular example are. The very top thing, radio name, is literally an alias for your own reference. It doesn't get shown on the radio because, of course, this is a radio that doesn't have a screen. But if you've got a radio that has a screen, that's not going to get shown anyway. If you have a radio that has a screen, what gets shown is either this, which is your call group, or this, which is the name of your channel. If there's a way to make this show up on the screen of a radio that has a screen, leave us a comment. Perhaps leave us a video reply, a video response, because here at Radiotronics, our tech team, we've never been able to do this. So if it's possible, let us know. But the most important part of programming DMR radios, or one of the most important things, is here, the radio ID. In any radio fleet, every single radio must have a different ID. It's sort of like a phone number, but it doesn't have to have any more than one digit. If you've only got 6 radios, you can have 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And that's very important. But what I usually do is I usually start at 101 or something like that, assuming that you're going to build a fleet up to 50 radios. You're never going to get past 200, for example. The rest of this lot doesn't really matter for this example, but what's important is that you've got radio ID, and you have a different radio ID every time you write to or clone to a radio. You must have a different radio ID. If you were to say, well, it doesn't matter, all my radios are ID1 and they speak to each other correctly, well, that will work, provided you're not using a system which requires some sort of cell call, some sort of selective calling. For example, a capacity plus system. But anyway, it's good practice, whether it needs to be or not, for a back-to-back system to make sure that every radio ID is different. So the code plug that you load into every radio is different. Right, so we'll start by creating a single channel. I'm going to delete these two. I can't delete them both, but I'll delete, because you've always got to have one channel. So if I delete this one, it'll leave that one, and vice versa. So let's first of all, let's delete the DMR channel. How you can tell the difference between a digital and an analog channel is, a digital channel has like a little step type icon, and this one is an analog channel, and that has like a little round which represents a wave, of course. Anyway, so let's rename that channel to analog. Okay, and you can only do that, by the way, really irritatingly, you can only do that by clicking on the zone and editing it there. You can't actually click into this channel and edit the name of the channel anywhere, which is really quite irritating, because in other DMR software by other manufacturers, you can. The place to edit it is the first thing. So, like I said before, we're going to start with an analog channel. It was already there, but just imagine I went add, and then I clicked on add analog channel, which is Shift and F5 if you want a shortcut. I should mention at this stage that I've got this software running in expert mode. MOTOTRBO has two modes. It's basic, which is a lot more basic. It slims down all the functions and features, and expert mode. I recommend that you keep it in expert mode, because there's certain things that you can't see in basic mode that are quite essential. I'm not really sure why Motorola decided that basic and expert mode were a good idea. Nevertheless, I don't use it. I stick to expert mode, as does every other engineer at Radiotronics. So I suggest that you do the same. Right, so let's start up here at the top. This is an analog channel again, just to be sure. So the first thing is the voice announcement file. All MOTOTRBO radios, every single one of them, is capable of voice announcements, and what they are is where you change the channel and it says channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, blah blah blah. You've got a whole section dedicated to it here, but it does require that the radio that you're working on has actually had the voice announcement files uploaded to them. And I'll touch on how to do that in another video, because it's not really relevant for this, because all we're going to do is get a radio capable of back-to-back communication. So we've got our analog channel. Let's go back. Voice announcement file, not relevant for this. Channel bandwidth, that'll be shown on your license. That's typically 12.5 kilohertz of channel spacing. On a supplier's light license, there are some 25 kilohertz space channels, but if you're just using a simple UK or a simple site license, then you're going to be using 12.5 kilohertz of channel space bandwidth. Scanlist will not really touch upon that today. We'll talk about that another day. Squelch you can leave at normal. Voice emphasis, just leave it exactly as it is there. You can enable voice enhancement on this radio. I've never noticed a problem with the audio quality of this radio. Leave that exactly where it is. The DP1400 also has a scrambling feature, as do pretty much all of Motorola's and Motorola's analog range, and their MOTOTRBO range when working in analog mode. But again, I don't really recommend you use it unless you really need to use it. But here's where it becomes interesting, and here's the bit that we're interested in. And I'll just move this to here so you can see the whole screen. So, for example, imagine that we're using a basic two-way radio on a basic simple channel. Let's imagine that we're on 165 megs. We can type it into this box here. Then we'll need to select a CT CSS tone. If you are using your own frequency that has been issued by Ofcom, there's no reason to use anything other than the CT CSS in which they've provided you, which will be, something that they've said that you should use. If you're using a simple UK license and you've got, I think, 5 or 7 VHF channels, literally type any one of those in here and you can select any CT/CSS you want. But really, unless you encounter any problems, you could just stick at 67. Now you'll see what I just did there. I pressed the copy button. That enables you to copy everything from this box that is contained in this box here into this box here, which is relatively useful if you're on a repeater-based system, because you can do that, for example. And what it'll do is it'll work out what -5 megahertz is in this example, or -5.5 megahertz is in this example, and put the correct transmit frequency into the box. For this example, we'd make sure that's 0 and click copy, and then it would make sure that anything is in this box is also in this box. I find that a much more reliable method of making sure that these two are accurate and they represent one another. Very simple things here at the bottom. So ref frequency, leave it exactly where it is. TPL reverse burst is absolutely not, do not touch that, leave that standard. Power level, leave it high, which will give you a 4 watts output on a UHF radio, 5 watts output on a VHF radio. Your talk out timer, leave at 60 seconds, that's fine. I mean, well, I'd actually probably set that at 30 seconds. What the talk out time, the timeout timer does, or the timeout timer, yeah, is it times the amount of time, the amount of seconds in which you've had the push to talk pressed, and it will electronically release the push to talk after that amount of seconds. The reason for this is that portable radios are not designed to be permanently transmitting, and the transistor gets pretty hot because they have inefficient antennas. Typically speaking, they're not correctly SWA'd to the right frequency. They're usually, you know, tuned to a range between 440 and 470 for VHF, 165 to 174 for, sorry, 440 to 470 for UHF, 165 to 174, sort of high band sort of thing for VHF. And that's not a very efficient method of tuning an antenna, but you don't really have much of a choice with portable antennas, unfortunately, unless, of course, you buy a really expensive pre-tuned antenna from Radiotronics, which we'll provide you with probably an antenna from Panorama, or one that we could have made ourselves in a partner factory that we use sometimes. But it's a lot of money. I mean, you can talk 25, 30 quid for an antenna that otherwise you could pay £6 or £7 for, maybe 10 quid at the most. So anyway, so yeah, you get. Oh, there's one other thing that I wanted to mention. Admit criteria. This, leaving it on the default, which is channel 3, is quite dangerous, because if you're in an area where there's quite a bit of, let's say, interference from people perhaps using similar frequencies to you, or machinery, or whatever, anything can cause RF interference, almost anything. Then you've got channel 3, you're saying, I only want to be able to push the push to talk button when the channel is completely free. Well, that's not really that's not a very good option. That I would suggest you just set that to always. There is one more option, and you can set it to the correct PL or correct tone. And what that means is that if there is no other transmission on the channel using your CT/CSS tone, and your CT/CSS tone in this example is 67.0, so what it's saying to the radio is that if there is no other transmission currently in the vicinity using that tone, allow the transmission. However, if there is somebody else in the vicinity, even if they're a mile away and it hears that tone ever so slightly, it's going to prevent you from transmitting. So unless you know that you are definitely on your own frequency issued by Ofcom, or issued by your local licensing agency if you're outside the United Kingdom, Comreg in Ireland and FCC, I suppose, in America, or whatever, if you haven't got your absolutely your own unique frequency, you're best off setting that to always. And that'll ensure that you can always press the push to talk button. It kind of does what it says on the tin. Okay. That would be how to set up an analog channel That's just an analog channel. There's nothing digital or DMR in this channel whatsoever. You could now write that to the radio you originally read from. You can clone that to a radio that you didn't read from, but is exactly the same. So if you've got 10 radios, you might have read the first one in, you're editing this file with regard to the first radio, you would write it back to the first radio, and then you would clone it to exist to other radios that are identical. Why can't you just click write to every radio? There is a reason. In here, you've got two things. You've got a model number that has to match no matter what. As long as that model number matches every single radio on the back of every radio, you can load this code plug into that particular radio using clone. However, if the serial number doesn't match, you can't write to that radio. You can only clone. What that means is that it will clone all of the settings within this radio, within this code plug, into the radio, but it won't try and write this exact code plug to it. It'll kind of write a clone replica of it. Might not make perfect sense, but try it out. So read one radio, write to that radio, and then try and write to other radios, and it won't let you. So then you'll need to clone to other radios. Anyway, moving on. Right, so that's an analog channel. All right, and I'll save this as an analog example for a VHF. Let's go to documents where I've already got one that I did a previous video. So go, we'll DP 1400 V, and then just put analog channel, or we'll change that to say one analog channel. Right, now what we'll do is we'll right click on there, click add digital channel, and then we'll delete this analog channel. Bear in mind I've saved that other code plug, and I'll put a link to it in the comments of this video. So if you need a VHF DP 1400 code plug, or you just want to kind of play around with the code plugs, I'll put both of these code plugs in the video description, not in the comments, of course, in the video description. Right, so this is now a digital channel, and you'll notice that the channel I've showed you before had like a wave type icon before it. This one's more like a little square, which represents the digital type wave logo that Motorola often use in their documentation. Again, this one's got the voice announcement file at the top. We'll not need to go through that because it's not interesting. But what is important is as we go down, again, we'll leave the scan thing there. We'll show you that another day. Color code. Okay, this is really important. This is kind of like the CT-CSS of the analog code plug. And the reason I showed you the CT-CSS, the analog side of the radio and the CT-CSS, was for this exact reason, because color code is almost the same thing, except for it's a digital tone as opposed to an analog tone. So when you transmit two things. You transmit three things. You transmit your own radio ID, that's transmitted in your digital data packet. You transmit your DMR group ID, and then you also transmit your color code. So they're the three things in which a digital transmission. Of course, there's also the voice that it's sending through, so there's four in theory, but those three things are the most important things. There are some radio systems, cheaper DMR radio systems, that completely ignore the DMR group completely. So it doesn't matter what group you're transmitting on, it'll completely ignore that, but it won't ignore the color code. There is a scanner. There's a AOR DV1 that will ignore the color code, but it'll display it on the screen, which is quite useful. But that's for another day. Okay, so we'll just leave color code at 1 for today. It doesn't really matter as long as it matches on every radio, but we'll leave it at 1. Now you've got something here. Now this is quite important, and the first time you ever try and write a radio, you'll probably get some sort of error that comes along the lines of saying invalid RAS key. And that RAS means restricted access to system. It's the way that a repeater allows only a certain amount of radios to actually connect to it, or a certain range of radios, or you can set a passcode, or you can say I'm only allowing DMR IDs 1 to 20 access to this particular repeater. That's incredibly useful from a security point of view. For a back-to-back radio, it's absolutely a red herring. You'll get an error that you'll never be able to work out. So turn it off. And while you're there, just pop to the security tab and click the delete. You'll see that this is restricted access to system, RAS. Just delete it. We don't need that right now. And all it'll do is serve to confuse you. So you'll notice now that we couldn't delete it before we set this to none, because it would have said, well, you've already got it in use. You're using that RAS key. Well, now we're not, and so I've deleted it as well. So there's absolutely no confusion. Right, so let's move on. Here, again, like we did in the last one, I'm just using 165 as an example. You can put whatever frequency in there. And then we just click copy, because the only thing it's going to copy across, as in the last example, is what's in this box. And that's the only thing in this box. So we can click copy. And then we just check that it did copy. And it did. Okay, leave ref frequency where it is. It's not important for this video. In group list, select list 1. That's default in every radio. You can call it whatever you want, and I'll go through that in a minute. But this is the receive, as in RX group list. And in the contact name, put call 1. Call 1 refers to the DMR group, and I'll go through that in just a second as well. I would suggest you leave emergency system as none, unless you want to introduce the lone worker feature, or you want to be able to activate the emergency feature manually, which is kind of part of the lone worker thing. And I'll go through lone worker on MOTOTRBO radios in another video, but for this one, leave it off. You don't need it right now. Voice activation is available in digital mode. Unless you're going to buy a voice activated earpiece. Voice activation doesn't work with just the radio. You have to have a voice activated or Vox enabled accessory to make that work. So unless you're going to buy a Vox accessory, leave that unticked. And I will do a future video explaining how Vox works and what accessories you need to make it work. But for this video, we're not going to be using that. Turn it off. The next one is power level, which you'll see is exactly the same as it was in analog mode, high or low. The timeout timer, again, leave that. I put that at 30. You can put that at whatever you want, but bear in mind the longer it goes on, the more strain you're putting on your radio's output transistor. And so keep that at 30, I think, in my opinion. I don't see how anybody will want to talk for more than 30 seconds on a business two-way radio. This is an interesting one. This will allow transmit interrupt, but leave it off for this. I'll do a video on transmit interrupt on a completely separate video. You probably remember that we had this exact I had this exact comment with admit criteria on the analog side. Again, if you're having back-to-back radios and they're not going through a repeater system, or they're not on your own issued frequency, put admit criteria to always. You can select color code free. If, like I said, it's the same as PL free or tone, you know, it not being able to find the tone in any incoming transmissions or interference. It works in exactly the same way, but I don't think that it's really going to be helpful for you unless, like I said, you're on your own frequency or you're going through a repeater or whatever. And that's pretty much it for this. Right, let's just explain what this is. So first of all, we'll explain what this is, this call 1. And if you go to here, that I just expanded the contacts section, and under digital, just in case that's collapsed on yours, I'll open it up again. You've got this call 1 here. What this relates to, this is the actual DMR ID, and this has already been created, but what this is a group call. So if you create another one, you'll see it's exactly the same. All right. Now, if you did have 2, you could have 1 per channel, for example. Well, let's delete that. Let's just keep things simple. If you've got call 1, and that's what it's called when you first read your radio from brand new. This DMR ID is one of those 3 digital elements that it sends along with your radio call. Now, this can be whatever you want it to be. But if you're just having back-to-back radios, it probably makes sense to just leave it number 1. You can put it as 101, but the fact is that as long as every single radio is sending the same DMR ID and they're set to receive, which I'll touch on in just a minute, the same DMR group, then everybody will be able to talk to each other. So here we go to the RX group list, and you'll notice if we just jump back to the channel, that was call 1, which corresponds to that there. And then group 1, which is your RX list, is here. Now, I've just removed that out of that group just to illustrate that it must be in that group. So when you first go to digital RX groups, then expand digital and then click on list 1. If there isn't a list 1, create a list 1. And then you'll see that you can then add call 1, which corresponds to this, there. What that means is that your radio will ignore anything that is not contained in list 1. So list 1 is looking for incoming calls only with the ID, with the group ID of 1. So your radio will not, it will ignore everything else. Now, your radio is now also programmed to transmit using that group ID. So therefore, you've now got two things that make your radio signal private. That doesn't mean to say it can't be listened in. It can, but I mean that you won't be exchanging messages and conversations with other radio users that have different color codes and groups. So the color code, again, that's here. That's got to be the same on every radio. And the transmit must be transmitting on your talk group, which again in this instance has an ID of 1. And then your receive must be set to receive that talk group, which again we've got list 1, and we've made available to it, or a member of it, call 1. So therefore it will drop its squelch, it will be listing out for color code 1 and group 1, or call 1 as it's nicknamed here. So, and again, that is pretty much it. You can now write to your original radio and clone to the rest of your radios, and that will pretty much do the job. That is one single channel. Now, people are going to say, let me, in fact, before we move on, let's just save that, as we've got one analog channel, so let's go one digital channel. Okay. Your team or your boss or your customer or whatever comes to you and says, "Hi Nigel, I need an extra channel," and you go, "Oh no, but I've only actually been given one channel by Ofcom." Well, that's not a problem, not with DMR. It would be a problem if you were operating on analog mode, because on analog mode, one channel equals one frequency. On DMR, that's a little different. So on DMR, we get to make use of slot A, slot B, or slot 1 and slot 2, as it's sometimes called. In Motorola, I think they call it slot 1 and slot 2. Pretty sure they do. Let's have a quick look. Yeah, they do. Right, and so here it is. So you've got slot 1, or time slot, and slot 2. If we leave channel 1 on slot 1, we can create another channel. When you're creating another channel that shares the attributes of a previous channel, I recommend you just click copy, click back onto zone, and click paste. What that will do is that will create an entirely identical channel in every way. And we're going to leave absolutely everything the same. So we're going to leave the color code the same, and we're going to leave the frequencies the same. But what we're going to do is we're going to change the time slot on channel 2 to time slot 2, and we're going to create 2 more groups. So let's go to digital, and you remember before we had call group 1, which has an ID of 1. Let's create another one. So another call group, and this time we'll go on to it, should I say, and this time we're going to create that as number 2. So that's got a different call ID, as you can see, 1 and 2. And then we need to create another digital group, receive group, or a digital receive list. And in this time, you'll notice that in the first one, we've only got call 1 being a member. And in this one, we're only going to have call 2 as a member. And we pop back to our channel, and you'll remember that We're still on the same frequency, that's fine, that's fine. But we're going to change this to call to and this to list to. Why this works is that time slot 2 and time slot 1 are on the same frequency. It's a technology called Tdma. I'll put a link to it in the video description, but it'll have to be after this video has been streamed because there's a live video. So that's why I can't cut bits out and refine this video, because it's a live stream. But I will put a link in the video description after this video has been streamed and uploaded, or streamed, or whatever the word is, to how Tdma works. We've got a really cool article on our website which explains on radiotronics.co.uk /information/knowledge base /something. Anyway, if you went to our website and clicked on information and clicked on knowledge base, there's something there. But there's a really comprehensive article on Wikipedia as well, which kind of explains how Tdma works. And in DMR, in the world of DMR, we have 2 time slots. So we have repeater time slot 1 and repeater time slot 2. That means that in theory we can have 2 simultaneous channels. But they are virtual channels. They're not in the truest sense of the word. They're just virtual voice channels or virtual data channels or whatever they're being used for. In this instance, we're using them for virtual voice channels. But it does mean that you can't just broadcast on both time slots with the same group ID. The reason I've used the same colour code, and I'll just touch on that because I will get a comment, I'm sure, is because if we were running via a repeater is always listening on both time slots, and it's listening usually with one colour code, so a single colour code for both time slots. As long as we have different DMR groups and a different RX list on our radios, the repeater will pretty much just repeat the exact DMR group it gets given on the exact time slot it's given it on. So if that makes sense, I'm sure it does. But in other words, we don't need to use different colour codes. In fact, it might not work if we do, but we do have to use different DMR groups, and we do have to use a different RX or receive group, receive list, if you will. And that's pretty much it. So this radio now transmits back to back on 2 separate channels, which are the same physical frequency, but it's on 2 completely different repeater slots with 2 completely different DMR groups. And that's it. You can write to your original radio, clone to the rest, and it'll pretty much work. I should say one thing. One thing that I always forget to do until the very last minute is set my buttons to not do things that I've not programmed my radio to do. So it might be worth you doing that, and all you do is you just go to the buttons tab here, and you quite simply just set every single one to unassigned. I always do that at the very end, and it's something that I should probably do at the very beginning, because otherwise you've got things attached to you like scrambling on and off, which unless you tick the box, it doesn't work anyway. Things like channel announcement might be automatically set. Well, you've got no channel announcement file. As you can see, there's no channel announcement file set. So anyway, I think that one of the first things you should do, and it's irony that I've told you this at the very end, is set your buttons to unassigned, just so that you don't have any buttons that are doing strange things that you didn't intend them to be doing. But that's pretty much it. That's some basic programming. So we've covered a single channel on analog, 2 channels on digital, so a single channel on digital and 2 channels on digital. Again, I'll save this one with, and I'll put it down there, and I will link to these from the video description after this video has been streamed. So that you can download these and you can play around with these and you can do all the stuff that I were doing, but also save yourself some time, because if you can't be bothered to do the stuff that I were doing, then all you really need to do is change 2 of the frequencies. Bear in mind this is a VHF code plug, so you can't load that into a UHF radio or change the frequencies and load it in. You're going to have to get your own UHF code plug by reading your radio. But other than that, I think that's pretty much it for today. Any comments, leave them in the box below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notification of future videos from Radiotronics.